Welcome, curious minds. Today, we're embarking on a journey into a region that, well, despite its profound global impact, often gets reduced to just economic headlines.
Yeah,
Europe.
that's right.
But what if the deepest story of Europe isn't really found in its balance sheets or the latest EU summit news, but, literally on its map? We're talking about this silent, powerful force that has shaped its destiny for millennia.
Precisely. And while the contemporary narrative often frames Europe through, let's say, its financial challenges or its role in global markets, our deep dive today is into Robert D. Kaplan's really insightful work, The Revenge of Geography. It invites us to see something far more fundamental.
Okay.
We're going to unpack how Europe, this continent of surprising size and real strategic importance, has been and continues to be profoundly influenced by its unique geographical features. And these features haven't just shaped its history. They've led to both its remarkable moments of unity and, well, its persistent, seemingly intractable divisions. Get ready to see Europe through a lens where the landscape itself kind of whispers tales of power and identity.
Okay, let's unpack this right away because Kaplan truly challenges a common perception, doesn't he? When we talk about contemporary geopolitics, all the constant changes and shifts, our focus naturally tends to drift towards Afro-Asia. We look at the Middle East, we look at China, we examine the dynamic shifts happening across that huge area. Europe, on the other hand, often feels like it's, well, left out of that core geopolitical equation. It gets relegated to being primarily a financial story.
Yeah, like it's just about the Eurozone crisis or trade deals.
Exactly. It's often seen as stable, maybe even a bit, I don't know, stagnant, just this economic block.
And this, Kaplan argues really powerfully, is a significant misjudgment. While the narratives coming out of the Middle East and Asia are undeniably crucial for understanding the 21st century, overlooking Europe's enduring geopolitical significance means missing a massive piece of the global puzzle.
Okay.
The reality check is quite striking, actually. The European Union's population stands at a staggering 500 million people.
Wow.
To put that in perspective, that's the third largest in the world, only surpassed by China and India. So if you're just considering sheer human scale and potential, Europe is far from a sidelight. It's a major player.
That's a huge number, certainly not one you can just dismiss. And economically, it's even more impressive, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The EU's economy is a colossal $16 trillion.
16 trillion.
Yep, which actually surpasses that of the United States. So whether we're talking about population or economic might, Europe is not just a sideline. It's a genuine heavyweight on the global stage.
Given these really powerful economic and demographic figures, it almost makes you wonder why Europe is still so often reduced to just a financial story in contemporary geopolitical discussions. What do you think contributes to that persistent misconception?
That's a really excellent question. I think part of it is the post-Cold War narrative shift. Less focus on ideological battle lines, more on economic integration and shared values, that kind of thing.
Makes sense.
But beneath those narratives, its geographical positioning remains absolutely key. Europe lies, quite literally, at the heart of the eastern or land hemisphere.
Or heart of the land hemisphere.
Yeah, think about that for a moment. From its western edge, it faces the core of North America. It's actually as close to the southern cone of South America as the U.S. is.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
And from its eastern extremity, it overlooks Afro-Eurasia, kind of equidistant from the Russian Far East and South Africa. This isn't just a convenient location, it's strategically central. It's a pivot point connecting these vast global regions.
So what does this all mean for understanding the world's power dynamics then? Kaplan argues, and you mentioned this is based on his book, that a truly comprehensive geographical explanation of world politics must begin with Europe.
Exactly.
And this isn't a new idea either, right? You said thinkers like Mackinder, Spikeman, Morgenthau, they largely based their foundational work on Europe.
That's right. Their theories, which we've touched on before, really saw Europe as the starting point. The profound insight here, according to Kaplan, is that to understand how the world has evolved since their time, especially now in the 21st century, it helps immensely to start right where they did, by examining Europe's indelible geographical imprint.
So even with other important perspectives like Marshall Hodgson emphasizing the Near East?
Right. Hodgson's focus on the Near Eastern oikoumene, that ancient cradle of civilization, is absolutely valid and incredibly important. But Kaplan's point is that beginning with Europe offers a direct, sort of organic pathway into a geographical consideration of Russia, China, the Indian subcontinent, and the greater Middle East.
Okay, so it's a path.
In essence, as Kaplan demonstrates, to understand geopolitics in the 21st century, we first have to understand the 20th, and that journey, he argues, decisively starts with Europe and its deep geographical roots.
That's a powerful setup, seeing Europe not just as a financial headline, but as this deeply rooted geopolitical entity shaped by forces far older than any market trend. So if Europe is indeed this geopolitical giant, the deeper question then becomes, what are these ancient, almost primal forces within its very landscape that have not only unified it at times, but also etched these deep and persistent divisions throughout its history? Let's dive into what Kaplan calls Europe's delicious complexity, the raw power of its physical landscape. It's truly a geographical anomaly, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Just consider how Oxford archaeologist Barry Cunliffe describes Europe. He calls it the westerly excrescence of the continent of Asia.
A westerly excrescence, like an outgrowth.
Exactly. Building on William McNeill's thesis, it's essentially this massive peninsula that, maybe against many geographical expectations, rose to dominate world politics in the second millennium AD. The really profound insight here is that this wasn't just chance. Geography fundamentally ordained a unique trajectory for this part of the world.
And a key starting point for that trajectory was its congenial ecozone, as Kaplan puts it.
Europe sits perfectly between the harsh deserts of Africa to the south and the unforgiving ice sheets of the Arctic to the north. Its climate is wonderfully moderated by the Gulf Stream, and historically, it was incredibly rich in natural resources.
Like wood, stone.
Abundant wood for construction and fuel, sturdy stone for building, vital metals for tools and weapons, furs for trade and warmth. This wasn't a harsh, resource-poor land. It was nurturing, incredibly fertile.
Okay, but here's where it gets maybe counterintuitive. The crucial role of its coastline and waterways. You mentioned this earlier.
Yes, this is fascinating. Europe has what Kaplan describes as a deviating and shattered coastline.
Shattered coastline.
Imagine this. It's intricately indented with countless natural harbors, cluttered with islands and half-islands. And it stretches an epic 23,000 miles.
23,000 miles. That's cheers.
Equal to the Earth's circumference. It's a truly staggering detail. This gives Europe the highest ratio of coastline to landmass of any continent.
Wow.
And the truly profound insight Kaplan offers is how this seemingly chaotic, fractured coastline didn't hinder Europe. It actually catapulted it into global dominance. It fostered unparalleled maritime dynamism and shaped its unique identity.
23,000 miles. It's almost hard to visualize. And it's not just the exterior coastline, right? Europe is squeezed by these internal seas, too.
Exactly. No fewer than 4 enclosed and semi-enclosed seas.
Huh.
The Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Baltic, and the North Sea. These weren't just boundaries. They were, in essence, natural highways. They connected disparate regions and cultures, facilitating trade and the exchange of ideas long before modern infrastructure.
And then there are the rivers.
Coupled with that, Europe is blessed with an advantageous riverine topography, featuring numerous cross-peninsula routes. Think of the mighty Rhine and the Elbe arteries of trade and culture for centuries.
And the Danube you mentioned.
And then there's the Danube. As the acclaimed Italian writer Claudio Magris, who really champions Central Europe and its identity so eloquently describes it, the Danube draws German culture towards the east, mingling it with other cultures in countless hybrid metamorphoses.
It's a beautiful imagery.
It perfectly captures how these waterways weren't just routes for goods, but for the very mixing of peoples, ideas, and traditions.
That image of mingling cultures is so vivid. And it wasn't just rivers either. There were these strategic land corridors, too, acting like historical superhighways.
Absolutely. We're talking about crucial passages like the Moravian Gap, the Brenner Pass through the Alps, and that broad, relatively flat plain running through France down to the Rhone Valley. These aren't just features on a map, they're pathways of history. They allowed everything from conquering armies to adventurous merchants to revolutionary ideas to flow across the continent.
So you have this intense interaction of land and water.
And this elaborate interface between land and water, combined with Europe's unique position protected from, yet crucially accessible to, the vast global ocean, fostered incredible maritime dynamism and mobility among its peoples. But, and this is key, it also contributed to an intense range of strikingly different landscapes within Europe itself, often within relatively short distances.
So how exactly does this geographical complexity, these incredibly diverse landscapes often packed into small areas, translate into what Kaplan calls the outbreak of power politics? Can you give us a concrete example of that dynamic playing out?
It's a fundamental connection. The geographical complexity led to the emergence of distinct human communities, each shaped by their immediate surroundings, fiercely guarding their identity and resources. Think about it. From the constantly warring Athenians and Spartans, the Romans, Iberians, Phoenicians, Scythians in antiquity,
Right, the classic
to
example.
the seemingly endless conflicts between French, Germans, and Russians, and between Prussians, Habsburgs, and Ottomans in the modern era. The core insight here, from Kaplan's perspective, is that these divisions and conflicts weren't just about political ideologies or dynastic rivalries, though those played a part. They had deep, enduring geographical roots. Proximity and distinct physical environments fostered both competition and unique cultural paths.
Yet, paradoxically, despite these deep-seated divisions, there's also this underlying cohesion to Europe, isn't there? Kaplan points to a lowland corridor, for example.
Yes, stretching from the Atlantic all the way to the Black Sea, it allowed travelers for centuries to cross the length of Europe in relative comfort. This contributed to Europe's profound cohesion and what Magris calls its superior sense of itself.
And the distances aren't actually that vast internally.
Exactly. Relatively short internal distances. Lisbon to Warsaw, one end of Europe to the other, is only about 1,500 miles. That's another unifying factor, making interaction and integration much more feasible than on other vaster continents like Asia or Africa.
So this complex interplay, division, and cohesion, it shapes the very idea of Europe.
This leads to another profound insight from Kaplan, how geography helped determine the very idea called Europe. This concept emerged as a geographical expression of liberal humanism, particularly through the post-World War II merging of sovereignty, a direct reaction, really, to centuries of devastating military conflict.
Trying to prevent it from happening again?
Precisely. But concurrently, this same geography also birthed several Europes, often in conflict with each other. The economic divisions we see today, like the Greek debt crisis that rocked the Eurozone.
Yeah, that was huge.
Kaplan argues these aren't just contemporary financial issues. The deep insight is that they are, in truth, timeless expressions of geography, reflecting differing development patterns rooted in the land itself, passed down through generations.
That last point about economic divisions being timeless expressions of geography is really powerful, and it brings us directly to the deep roots of Europe's internal divisions. The ancient split between North and South, and that equally profound East-West rift.
Mhm.
When we look at where civilization first took root, it was predominantly in those warm, protected river valleys like the Nile, Tigris-Euphrates, and the Greek and Italian peninsulas. These areas, needing only rudimentary technology, were hospitable for early settlements, allowing populations to thrive.
And the renowned French historian Fernand Braudel's view on this is so insightful. He saw Mediterranean societies, despite their incredible innovations like Athenian democracy and the Roman Republic, as largely defined by traditionalism and rigidity.
Rigidity, why?
Well, the poor quality of Mediterranean soils, combined with a hot, arid climate, tended to favor large landholdings. These were, almost by necessity, controlled by the wealthy elite. This, in turn, contributed to inflexible social orders, cementing power in the hands of a few families or powerful institutions for long periods.
Okay, so the land itself encouraged a certain social structure.
Arguably, yes. In stark contrast, the richer, more varied soils of northern European forest clearings fostered what Kaplan, drawing on others, calls a freer civilization. Anchored by the more flexible, informal power relationships of feudalism, these communities were much better poised to exploit new inventions like movable type and other emerging technologies down the line.
So while human agency, like the Reformation or the Enlightenment, was obviously crucial,
Absolutely pivotal. But the profound insight Kaplan emphasizes is that this kind of dynamic, inventive culture couldn't have flourished in the same way without the geographical backdrop, the immense river and ocean access, the fertile Loess earth, rich with coal and iron ore deposits. This physical environment formed the stage for individual innovation and industrialization in a way the Mediterranean perhaps couldn't.
and Rome played a huge role in this northward shift, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely pivotal.
Yeah.
Before the Common Era, Rome expanded north, bringing political order and domestic security for the first time from the Carpathians all the way to the Atlantic. This vast, well-watered European black soil heartland, with its sprawling forests, saw the emergence of large settlement complexes, the oppida.
How did it?
Yeah, large fortified settlements. They provided the rudimentary foundation for medieval and modern cities. This centralized Roman power also laid down infrastructure, like roads and administrative networks, that would endure for centuries.
And just as Roman expansion brought stability, its eventual breakup centuries later led to the formation of the peoples and nation-states we recognize today.
Exactly. This process was formalized, much later, by the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, which ended the devastating 30 Years' War. As the historian William Anthony Hay explains, the collapse of Roman power, coupled with nomadic incursions from the steppe, created a power vacuum.
Right.
This allowed distinct peoples, no longer under Rome's singular unifying rule, to forge their own identities and eventually their own nations, particularly in Central and Northwestern Europe. The Mediterranean's ancient geographic hold, as Kaplan puts it, slackened. This gave way to the Middle Ages and later the Arab sweeps across the southern rim.
So history started moving north.
The profound insight here is that by the 11th century, Europe's map already had a surprisingly modern appearance. Countries like France and Poland were roughly in their present shapes, and the Holy Roman Empire resembled a united Germany. This marked a clear trajectory, as Kaplan puts it. Thus did history move north.
And then the Atlantic comes into play.
What's truly striking here is how the pull of the colder Atlantic opened up global shipping routes, ultimately dominating the enclosed Mediterranean. While Portugal and Spain, with their protruding peninsular positions, were the early beneficiaries of this Atlantic trade, think of their vast empires in the Americas.
Right. Columbus, Magellan.
Their pre-Enlightenment societies, which Kaplan notes were kind of traumatized by the proximity, and in Spain's case, occupation by North African Muslims, eventually lost ground. They lost out to the more open, commercially agile Dutch, French, and English in the oceanic competition.
So the deep insight here is, just as Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire succeeded Rome, in modern times, Northern Europe has now succeeded Southern Europe as the economic and political heart.
That's Kaplan's argument, yes. The mineral-rich Carolingian core, which we mentioned earlier, that industrial heartland stretching from parts of France into Germany and the Benelux countries, has clearly won out in the form of the European Union driving its machinery. This ascendancy is, in no small measure, because of geography and the distinct forms of social and economic development it fostered over centuries.
But the divisions don't stop at North versus South. Europe is also plagued by these deep rifts between West and East, and even between the Northwest and the center.
Absolutely. Consider the Danube again, for instance. Its valley continues eastward, beyond the Great Hungarian Plain, the Balkans, and the Black Sea, all the way through the Pontic and Kazakh steppes to Mongolia and China. This isn't just a river, it's a historical superhighway connecting distant worlds.
A pathway for peoples and ideas, but also maybe invasions.
Precisely. This geographical fact, combined with the flat, unimpeded access to Russia further north across the North European plain, directly underpins Mackinder's geographical pivot of history. It helps explain the waves of invasions, mainly of Slavic and Turkic peoples from the east, that have so profoundly shaped Europe's political destiny over millennia.
So the profound insight is that just as there is a Carolingian Europe and a Mediterranean Europe, there's also, often shaped by these invasions, a Byzantine Ottoman Europe, a Prussian Europe, and a Habsburg Europe.
Exactly. Each is geographically distinct, exhibiting differing economic development patterns that, as Kaplan argues, a single currency or a single political union cannot simply erase overnight. These are fault lines deeply etched into the continent's very fabric.
And the roots of this East-West rift are incredibly deep, going back to Rome itself.
Yes. Take the 4th century AD split of the Roman Empire into Western and Eastern halves. Rome remained the capital of the Western Empire, eventually giving way to Charlemagne's kingdom and the Vatican, what we largely know as Western Europe. Constantinople became the capital of the Eastern Empire, Byzantium, populated mainly by Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians, and later, of course, by Muslims after the Ottoman Turks captured it in 1453.
And the border between these two halves ran right through.
The critical insight here is that the border between these Eastern and Western empires ran directly through the middle of what would eventually become the multi-ethnic state of Yugoslavia after World War I.
Wow.
So when Yugoslavia broke apart violently in 1991, the initial divisions eerily echoed those of Rome 16 centuries earlier. The Slovenes and Croats were Roman Catholics, heirs to a tradition stretching back through Austria-Hungary to Rome in the West. The Serbs were Eastern Orthodox, heirs to the Ottoman Byzantine legacy of Rome in the East. This wasn't just a modern conflict. Kaplan suggests it was like a ghost of ancient geographical and cultural divides resurfacing.
That's chilling, actually. And the Carpathians reinforce this.
Yes, the Carpathian Mountains, running northeast of former Yugoslavia and dividing Romania, partially reinforced this ancient boundary between Rome and Byzantium, and later between the Habsburg emperors in Vienna and the Turkish sultans in Constantinople.
So not a hard border like the Alps,
So
but
exactly. While passes and trade routes did exist through these formidable mountains, bringing the cultural repository of Middle Europa, Central Europe deep into the Byzantine and Ottoman Balkans, the Carpathians weren't an impermeable wall. Instead, they marked a gradation, a subtle but significant shift in the balance from one Europe to another.
and the result of this historical gradation is
That southeastern Europe, particularly the Balkans, would historically tend to be poorer, not only compared to northwestern Europe, but also in comparison to northeastern Europe with its Prussian tradition. To put it simply, the Balkans were poorer not only than, say, the Benelux countries, but also than Poland and Hungary. The enduring insight here, according to Kaplan, is that these ancient geographical divisions continue to manifest in modern economic disparities, shaping the very fabric of the European Union today.
the collapse of the Berlin Wall must have brought these divisions into really sharp relief.
Oh, absolutely. The Warsaw Pact was effectively a full-fledged Eastern Empire ruled from Moscow. It imposed military occupation and what Kaplan calls freeze-frame poverty through centrally planned command economies.
Freeze-frame poverty.
For 44 years of Kremlin rule, much of Prussian, Habsburg, and Byzantine Ottoman Europe was locked away in a Soviet prison of nations, collectively known as Eastern Europe. Their development was essentially put on hold or drastically distorted.
Meanwhile, in Western Europe, the EU project was moving forward.
Exactly. It began as the Franco-German coal and steel community, then evolved into the common market, and finally the European Union itself. It built out from its Carolingian base, France, Germany, Benelux, to encompass Italy, Great Britain, and later Greece and the Iberian nations.
So the West had a head start.
The profound insight here is that because of its massive economic head start during the Cold War years, Carolingian Europe, firmly inside NATO, emerged much stronger, at least for the time being. It overshadowed historically prosperous regions like Prussian northeastern Europe and Danubian Middle Europa, which had been trapped behind the Iron Curtain in the Warsaw Pact for decades.
But Kaplan also stresses human agency, right? It's not all geography.
Absolutely crucial point. While geography is this powerful silent force, human agency also plays a central role. Kaplan acknowledges this. While the Soviet thrust into Central Europe after World War II certainly seemed to bear out Mackinder's thesis about Asiatic invasions shaping European destiny, we can't carry this geographical determinism too far. Without the specific actions of one man, Adolf Hitler, World War II wouldn't have happened in the way it did, and there would have been no Soviet invasion in the first place, or at least not that one.
So history could have been very different.
Immensely different. But Hitler did exist, and so we are left with the geopolitical situation as we have it today. This complex tapestry woven from both deep-seated geographical realities and human choices, often catastrophic ones.
And today's situation sees the Europe of Charlemagne still largely ruling, but because of the resurgence of a united Germany, the balance of power within Europe is subtly shifting eastward.
Yes, shifting towards the confluence of Prussia and Middle Europa. German economic power is palpably invigorating Poland, the Baltic states, the Upper Danube region. Conversely, the Mediterranean seaboard and the Byzantine Ottoman Balkans continue to lag behind.
And Greece is an interesting case here.
Very much so. Greece, for instance, at the northwestern edge of Hodgson's Near Eastern Oikumene, benefits from its ancient geography. The place where Kaplan suggests the heartless systems of Egypt and Persia Mesopotamia could be softened and humanized, leading to the invention of the West, so to speak.
The birthplace of democracy.
Right. But in today's Europe, dominated from the north, Greece finds itself, in Kaplan's view, at the wrong, orientalized end of things. While it's more stable and prosperous than places like Bulgaria and Kosovo, he suggests that's largely because it was spared the ravages of communism, not necessarily because its internal structures aligned perfectly with the Northern European model.
And those internal structures have economic consequences.
Definitely. The economic issues in Greece, for example, really highlight this. Kaplan argues they have deep cultural and therefore historical and geographical roots. He points out that around 3/4 of Greek businesses are family-owned and rely heavily on family labor.
Which means
Well, minimum wage laws often don't apply in the same way, and those without family connections can find their promotion prospects hindered. These aren't just quirks or modern inefficiencies. Kaplan sees them as systemic issues rooted in centuries of distinct geographical and cultural development patterns, different from those further north.
So geography explains so much of this mosaic. When the Warsaw Pact broke up, the path countries took depended a lot on where they were on the map.
It seems that way. According to Kaplan's analysis, the formerly captive countries advanced economically and politically almost exactly according to their positions on the map. Poland and the Baltic states, along with Hungary and the Bohemian end of Czechoslovakia closer to the west, historically linked to Prussia or Habsburg realms, performed the best initially.
While the Balkans struggled more.
The Balkan countries further south tended to suffer more from destitution and unrest. Despite all the immense upheavals of the 20th century, including the pulverizing effect of Nazism and communism, the legacies of Prussian, Habsburg, and Byzantine and Ottoman rules are still profoundly relevant.
Because those empires were shaped by geography.
The core insight Kaplan offers is that these empires were, first and foremost, creatures of geography, profoundly influenced by Mackinderesque migration patterns from the Asiatic East, and their influence, their ways of organizing society and economy, echoes right down to this day.
So if you look at that 11th century map of Europe again, the Holy Roman Empire, like a united Germany at the center, surrounded by Burgundy, Bohemia, Pomerania, Estonia, Aragon, Castile, it really makes you reflect on the deep continuity.
It does. Now consider the regional success stories in the 21st century, mainly in Carolingian Europe. Baden-Württemberg in Germany, the Rhone Alps in France, Lombardy in Italy, Catalonia in Spain. These, as the historian Tony Jute reminds us, are for the most part northerners.
And they look down on the south.
You'd suggest they sometimes peer down on the so-called backward, lazy, subsidized Mediterranean South, even as they might look in horror at the prospect of Balkan nations like Romania and Bulgaria joining the European Union, fearing they will further strain the system.
It's this dynamic of center versus periphery again.
Yes, with the losers in the periphery generally, though not exclusively located in those regions geographically closer to the Middle East and North Africa. But precisely because the Brussels-headquartered European superstate has arguably worked well enough for the prosperous northerly subregions, they've been liberated from their own one-size-fits-all national governments, flourishing by occupying historically anchored economic, political, and cultural niches.
So regionalism can be a strength.
It suggests a strength in regionalism that can even transcend national borders, at least economically.
But beyond this dissatisfaction with Europe's losers, there's this underlying unease, isn't there, about demographics?
Yes, among prosperous northern Europeans especially, over the dissolution of society itself, or at least its transformation. National populations and labor forces are demographically stagnant and aging quite rapidly.
I've seen those projections.
Europe is projected to lose maybe 24% of its prime working age population by 2050, while its population over 60 could rise by nearly 50% in that same time frame.
That's a huge shift.
It is. And this demographic shift is likely to lead to increased immigration, particularly of young people from the developing world, just to support Europe's aging welfare states. While reports of, say, Muslim domination of Europe have often been exaggerated, Kaplan notes the percentage of Muslims in major European countries is projected to more than triple by mid-century, from around 3% currently to perhaps 10% of the total population.
And this feeds into the bigger picture of Europe's relative standing globally.
Absolutely. It's striking to think that in 1913, Europe actually had more people than China.
More than China, wow.
But by 2050, the combined populations of Europe, the United States, and Canada will comprise just about 12% of the world total. That's a stark drop from 33% right after World War I.
So Europe is shrinking relative to the rest of the world?
The profound insight here, from a demographic perspective, is that Europe is certainly in the process of being demographically diminished relative to the rest of Asia and Africa, even as European populations themselves are becoming more ethnically diverse, more African and Middle Eastern due to migration.
This demographic shift and the reemergence of Germany as this central power brings us directly to the post-Cold War landscape and Germany's undeniable ascendancy.
Exactly. The very fact of a united Germany inevitably means comparatively less influence for the European Union as a whole than in the days of a divided Germany. That's simply due to united Germany's sheer geographical, demographic, and economic preponderance right at the heart of Europe.
The numbers really tell that story.
They do. Germany's population is now around 82 million, compared to 62 million in France and almost 60 million in Italy. Germany's GDP is a massive $3.65 trillion, significantly larger than France's $2.85 trillion and Italy's $2.29 trillion.
And its reach is wider, too.
Crucially, yes. While France's economic influence is mainly limited to the countries of Cold War Western Europe, German economic influence encompasses both Western Europe and the former Warsaw Pact states. The deep insight here is that this is a clear testament to its more central geographical position and its extensive, historically rooted trade links with both East and West.
And Kaplan mentions a cultural factor, too, beyond just geography.
Yes, beyond its powerful geographical position, straddling both maritime Europe and Middle Europa, he argues Germans also have a sort of built-in cultural attitude toward trade. He quotes Norbert Walter, who was a senior economist for Deutsche Bank, observing something like, Germans would rather dominate real economic activities. We keep clients, we find out what they need, developing niches and relationships over the decades.
A long-term view.
Exactly. And this is greatly aided by what Kaplan calls a particularly German dynamism. He cites the political philosopher Peter Kozlowski, who explained it by saying something like, because so many Germans started from zero after World War II, they are aggressively modernist. Modernism and middle-class culture have been raised to the status of ideologies here. This combination of a practical trade focus and this drive for modern innovation creates a really potent economic engine.
And Germany's internal structure helps, too, the federal system.
Yes, its spatial organization is also a key advantage in an era of flourishing Northern European regions. Because of the tradition of small independent states arising from the 30 Years' War back in the 17th century, which still guides Germany's federal system today, there isn't one huge pressure cooker capital dominating everything like Paris or London.
Right, it's more spread out.
Instead, there's a dynamic network of smaller, specialized centers. Hamburg is a media hub, Munich a fashion center, Frankfurt the undisputed banking heart, and so on. All connected by an impartial railway system that radiates in all directions. Germany came late to unification in the second half of the 19th century, which ironically helped preserve this regional flavor. And that's a huge advantage in today's decentralized Europe.
And the fall of the Berlin Wall is still relatively recent history.
Very recent in historical terms, yes. Trends often take decades to fully emerge. But its fall has reconnected Germany to Central Europe in profound ways. Kaplan suggests this is subtly recreating, in informal economic and cultural ways, the sphere of influence of the First and Second Reichs, roughly equivalent to the Holy Roman Empire's traditional reach. It's a reassertion of historical geographical centrality.
And the relationship with Poland is key here, too.
Beyond the wall's collapse, another crucial factor, buttressing German geopolitical strength, according to Kaplan, has been the historic German-Polish reconciliation that occurred during the mid-1990s. He cites former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, who wrote something like, through Poland, German influence could radiate northward into the Baltic states and eastward into Ukraine and Belarus.
So Germany benefits from a wider Europe.
The profound insight here is that German power is enhanced by both a larger, integrated Europe and a Europe where Middle Europa reemerges as a separate, thriving economic and political entity with Germany naturally at its core.
This all brings us to a really core European question, one with huge implications for global stability. The Russia-Germany dynamic. And a critical factor in this evolution will be the degree to which European and particularly German quasi-pacifism holds up in the future.
Right. As the strategist Colin Gray writes, they were snake-bitten on the Somme at Verdun and by the Götterdämmerung of 1945. He argues the powers of West Central Europe have been convincingly de-Bellicized.
De-Bellicized? Meaning their appetite for war is gone.
Essentially, yes. Their appetite for large-scale military solutions has been profoundly diminished by the sheer horror of past wars.
And it wasn't just the legacy of war, right? There was the U.S. security umbrella, too.
Exactly. It hasn't only been the legacy of war and destruction that makes Europeans generally averse to military solutions, aside from peacekeeping and maybe humanitarian interventions. It's also the fact that during the Cold War decades, Europe largely had its security provided by the American superpower.
And now there's no big conventional threat on the borders.
Correct.
Yeah.
Today, it faces no palpable conventional threat from uniformed armies massing on its borders. As the German-American academic Joseph Joffe puts it, maybe a bit provocatively, the threat to Europe comes not in the form of uniforms, but in the tattered garb of refugees.
But this raises a big question. What if Mackinder was right? What about Russia?
Precisely. What if, as Mackinder forewarned, Europe's destiny is still subordinate to Asiatic history, in the form of a resurgent Russia. Then, a different kind of threat emerges. Kaplan argues that the same drivers that pushed the Soviet Union to carve out an empire in Eastern Europe after World War II still hold some sway today.
Which are?
A legacy, perceived or real, of depredations against Russia by Lithuanians, Poles, Swedes, Frenchmen, Germans, leading to a deep-seated perceived need for a cordon sanitaire, a buffer zone of compliant regimes in that vast exposed space between historic Russia and Central Europe.
Now, Kaplan isn't saying tanks are going to roll again.
No. To be clear, he isn't suggesting Russia is going to deploy land forces to reoccupy Eastern Europe for a new cordon sanitaire in the traditional sense. However, the profound insight he offers is that through a combination of political and economic pressure, partly owing to Europe's reliance on Russian natural gas, Russia could exert undue influence on its former satellites in the years to come.
The energy dependence is key.
It's significant. Russia supplies some 25% of Europe's gas overall, 40% of Germany's, and nearly 100% of Finland's and the Baltic states. Moreover, as Europe grapples with its own economic and sometimes currency crises, Kaplan suggests we might all wake up to a world with greater Russian influence within the continent. Russia's investment activities, alongside its critical role as an energy supplier, will loom larger in a potentially weakened and newly divided Europe.
So this presents two possible futures for Europe, deeply influenced by these geographical and historical forces. What's scenario one?
Scenario one, the pessimistic one, perhaps? Will a debilitized Germany partly succumb to Russian influence, leading to what Kaplan calls a somewhat Finlandized Eastern Europe, where nations maintain nominal independence but are deeply influenced by Russia, and an even more hollow North Atlantic Treaty Alliance?
Finlandized, like during the Cold War.
Exactly. This scenario would, unfortunately, seem to prove the fears of Mackinder and other geographers right. That in a geographical sense there is no true Central Europe or Middle Europa, only a maritime Europe, Western Europe, and a continental one dominated by Russia, with a vulnerable crush zone in between.
Okay, what's scenario two, the more optimistic one?
Scenario two. Will Germany subtly stand up to Russia through various political and economic means, even as its society remains immersed in this post-heroic quasi-pacifism? This latter scenario would present a richly complex European destiny.
Who so?
One in which Central Europe would fully reappear and flower, perhaps for the first time since before World War I. A tier of states between Germany and Russia would equally flourish, as Mackinder himself actually hoped for, leaving Europe largely in peace, even as its aversion to military deployments might be geopolitically inconvenient for allies like the United States.
And in this scenario, Russia accepts this.
In this scenario, Russia would accommodate itself to countries as far east as Ukraine and Georgia, eventually joining Europe in some fashion. Thus, the idea of Europe, as a geographical expression of historic liberalism, would finally be realized. Kaplan frames it like this. Europe went through centuries of political rearrangements after Rome's collapse. And in search of that liberal ideal, Europe will continue to rearrange itself following what he calls the Long European War of 1914-1989.
The Long European War. Interesting framing. And in all these rearrangements, Greece, perhaps surprisingly, serves as a kind of neurometer.
Yes, Kaplan argues it provides an insightful register of the health of the entire European project. Of all places, Greece is truly unique geographically. It's the only part of the Balkans accessible on several seaboards to the Mediterranean, acting as a potential unifier of two European worlds, a natural bridge between East and West.
It's a true cultural crossroads, embodying both Europe's classical origins and its complex relationship with the East.
Absolutely. Geographically equidistant between Brussels and Moscow, Greece is arguably as close to Russia culturally as it is to Western Europe, by virtue of its Eastern Orthodox Christianity, a direct legacy of Byzantium.
And its modern history reflects this tension.
Throughout modern history, Greece has been burdened, Kaplan suggests, by political underdevelopment relative to the West. Its 19th century independence movement was primarily ethnic and religious, quite unlike Western European middle-class movements that sought political liberties and economic reforms alongside independence.
And its alignments reflect this unique position, too.
Consistently. He notes the Greek people overwhelmingly sided with Russia in favor of the Serbs during the 1999 Kosovo War, despite the Greek government's more equivocal official stance.
Sure.
Economically, it's the most troubled EU nation that was not part of the communist zone during the Cold War. Kaplan sees this not as a coincidence, but as a testament to these deep historical and geographical fault lines.
And you mentioned the family business structure earlier.
Yes. A key factor here, according to Kaplan, lies in its deep-seated cultural roots reflected in the economy. Roughly three-quarters of Greek businesses are family-owned and rely heavily on family labor. This means minimum wage laws often don't apply in practice, and those without family connections often find their promotion prospects are hindered. This is a phenomenon with deep cultural and therefore historical and geographical roots, a living example of how ancient societal structures, influenced by geography, continue to shape modern economic realities and challenges within the EU framework.
Going way back, Greece is where the West begins and ends, in a way.
Exactly. Going back to antiquity, Greece is where Europe and by inference the West both ends and begins. The ancient historian Herodotus chronicled the dichotomy between Greece and Persia, establishing a West versus East divide that has persisted in various forms for millennia.
And it was a pivot point in the Cold War, too.
Very much so. Greece barely remained in the Western camp at the beginning, owing to its own brutal civil war between rightists and communists, and those fateful negotiations between Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin that ultimately placed Greece within the Western sphere and eventually NATO.
And Mackinder saw Greece as critical, too, didn't he?
He did. Mackinder himself warned that Greece lies just outside the Eurasian heartland proper and is thus accessible to sea power. But his terrifying forewarning was that possession of Greece in some form by a heartland power, namely Russia, would probably carry with it the control of the world island.
Control of the world island, meaning Eurasia and Africa.
Essentially, yes. Imagine how much stronger the Kremlin's strategic position would have been during the Cold War had the negotiations between Churchill and Stalin gone differently and Greece had ended up inside the communist bloc. It would have directly endangered Italy across the Adriatic Sea, not to mention the entire Eastern Mediterranean and the greater Middle East. It could have fundamentally altered the global balance of power.
And this historical vulnerability, these internal structures, they came to a head with the financial crisis in 2010.
Absolutely. The Greek financial crisis, which Kaplan sees as emblematic of Greece's political and economic underdevelopment stemming from these deep roots, rocked the EU's currency system to its core. Because of the profound tensions it created between Northern and Southern European countries, it was arguably the most significant challenge to the European project since the wars of the Yugoslav secession in the 1990s. As Greece ably demonstrates, Europe remains a truly ambitious and sometimes fragile work in progress, with its destiny still very much unfolding.
And Europe's map is, in fact, continually rearranging itself, isn't it? It's not static.
Not at all. Historically, it shifted laterally westward after the Age of Exploration. Think about it. Cities like Quebec, Philadelphia, Havana became economically closer in a way to Western Europe than places like Krakow or Lvov in Eastern Europe.
And the Ottomans cut off the Balkans.
Exactly. Ottoman military advances physically cut off the Balkans from much of Europe for centuries, redirecting trade and cultural flows significantly.
But today, Europe is shifting in new, dramatic directions.
Yes. To the east, by admitting former communist nations into the EU, which subtly changes its geopolitical center of gravity, and also to the south, as it grapples with the political and economic stabilization, or lack thereof, of North Africa.
So the map is moving south.
The profound insight Kaplan offers here is that this means the map of Europe is effectively moving southward to encompass the entire Mediterranean world, much as it did, in different ways, not only under Rome, but under the Byzantines and Ottoman Turks, too.
That's a huge conceptual shift.
It is. For decades, autocratic regimes stifled North Africa, effectively cutting it off from the northern rim of the Mediterranean, providing Europe with little more than economic migrants. But as North African states evolve into what Kaplan calls messy democracies, the degree of political and economic interactions with nearby Europe will, over time, inevitably multiply.
Migrants might even go back.
It's possible. Some of those Arab migrants may even return home as new opportunities are created by reformist policies, however slow or chaotic. The Mediterranean, therefore, is poised to become a vital connector once again, rather than the divider it has largely been during most of the post-colonial era.
And this fits with Mackinder's view of the Sahara.
Entirely in keeping with Mackinder, who argued that the Sahara Desert denoted Europe's real southern boundary, because it effectively cut off equatorial Africa from the north, making the Mediterranean a true internal sea of the broader European North African civilized zone.
So Tunisia, Egypt, they become EU shadow zones.
Well, they aren't about to join the EU immediately, obviously. But Kaplan suggests they're becoming shadow zones of deepening EU involvement, indicating a growing interdependence, whether through aid, trade, migration management, or political influence. Thus, the EU itself will become an even more ambitious and frankly unwieldy project than ever before, stretching its boundaries and its mission.
So wrapping up, despite all these divisions, anxieties, growing pains, the EU remains a major global hub.
Absolutely. Nevertheless, the European Union, albeit beset by divisions, anxieties, and massive growing pains, will remain one of the world's great post-industrial hubs. The ongoing power shift within it subtly eastward, from the traditional centers of Brussels and Strasbourg towards Berlin, and more broadly from the European Union as a collective entity towards Germany as its indispensable driving force, will be pivotal to global politics in the coming decades.
And Germany, Russia, and Greece are key indicators.
For Kaplan, yes. He argues it is Germany, Russia, and perhaps surprisingly, even Greece, with its mere 11 million people, that most perceptively reveal Europe's destiny. Europe remains an ambitious work in progress, one that will be profoundly influenced by trends and convulsions spilling over from the south and east, in a world he describes as reeling from a crisis of room and competing influences.
So what does this all mean for us listening to this? We've seen how Europe's incredibly intricate geography, its fragmented coastlines, powerful rivers, historical land routes, has profoundly shaped everything from ancient conflicts to modern economic crises and these really complex power shifts. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that beneath the daily headlines, deeper, timeless forces are always at play, quietly yet powerfully influencing events. Considering these deep geographical roots that Kaplan lays out, how much of Europe's future, and maybe even our own future connected to it, is truly about human agency and political will, and how much is subtly yet powerfully kind of predestined by the very land we inhabit? What stands out most to you from all this?